The Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 wasn't just brutal, it was calculated psychological warfare that changed European history forever. But most people don't know the twisted genius behind how the Norse warriors chose their targets, or what they actually did when they got there. Picture this: you're a monk on a small island monastery off the coast of England. Your life revolves around prayer, copying manuscripts, and tending gardens. Your abbey sits on holy ground that hasn't seen violence in generations. The morning of June 8, 793, starts like any other, until someone spots dragon-headed ships cutting through the fog. The Vikings didn't stumble onto Lindisfarne by accident. They'd been watching, studying. These weren't mindless barbarians. They were strategic raiders who understood that monasteries held concentrated wealth with zero military defense. Gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, and illuminated manuscripts represented generations of accumulated treasure, all guarded by men who'd taken vows of peace. When the longships beached, the monks had nowhere to run. Lindisfarne is an island, accessible by land only during low tide. The Vikings had timed their arrival perfectly. What happened next became the template for Norse raiding strategy across Europe for the next 3 centuries. The raiders moved through the monastery with methodical efficiency. They knew exactly what they wanted: portable wealth. Heavy church bells got left behind. Golden crosses small enough to melt down? Those disappeared into sea chests. But the Vikings didn't just rob Lindisfarne, they sent a message. Monks were stripped naked and driven into the sea. Some drowned. Others were killed on the altar itself, their blood staining the same stones where they'd prayed hours earlier. A few were taken as slaves. The Vikings destroyed what they couldn't carry, smashing religious artwork that had taken decades to create. Why the excessive violence? Because terror was the point. News of Lindisfarne's destruction spread like wildfire across Christian Europe. The scholar Alcuin, writing from Charlemagne's court, called it an omen of the apocalypse. Churches and monasteries from Ireland to Francia suddenly realized they were vulnerable. And that fear, that's exactly what the Vikings wanted. See, the psychological impact multiplied their effectiveness. After Lindisfarne, when dragon ships appeared on any coastline, people fled inland immediately. Entire regions could be paralyzed by just a handful of ships. The Vikings had weaponized their reputation. But Lindisfarne was just the opening move. Fast forward to 845, and a man named Ragnar LotHB, yes, that Ragnar, is sailing up the Seine River with 120 ships. His target, Paris. The Frankish king Charles the Bald scrambles to organize a defense, splitting his army to guard both banks of the river. Fatal mistake. Ragnar attacks one side with overwhelming force, crushing that portion of the Frankish army while the other half watches helplessly from across the river. Then, in a move that still makes military historians shake their heads, Ragnar hangs 111 captured Frankish soldiers from trees in full view of Paris. On Easter Sunday. He's not just raiding, he's making a statement about the power of Christian kingdoms to protect their own people. Charles the Bald faces an impossible choice. His remaining forces can't defeat Ragnar's army. The Vikings are literally camped outside Paris, and plague has started spreading through the city. So Charles does something that will haunt European rulers for generations. He pays them to leave. 7,000 pounds of silver, a sum so enormous it takes days to count. Ragnar sails away rich, and every Viking chieftain in Scandinavia just learned the most important lesson of their careers. Threatening Christian cities is more profitable than actually sacking them. This is the birth of Danegeld, protection money paid to Vikings to prevent raids. It's essentially a medieval protection racket, and it works spectacularly well. The English would eventually pay tens of thousands of pounds in Danegeld. The Franks paid even more. Some historians estimate that the total wealth transferred from European kingdoms to Viking raiders through Danegeld exceeded the value of everything actually plundered in physical raids. The Vikings had accidentally invented a sustainable business model. But some Viking leaders weren't satisfied with payment. They wanted conquest. In 865, a massive Viking force called the Great Heathen Army lands in East Anglia. This isn't a raiding party, it's an invasion force designed to conquer and settle. Leading them are the sons of Ragnar LotHB, out to avenge their father's death at the hands of King Aella of Northumbria. The stories say Aella had thrown Ragnar into a pit of snakes. Whether that's true or Viking propaganda doesn't matter. Ragnar's sons believe it, and they're coming for revenge. The Great Heathen Army tears through England like a chainsaw through wet paper. They conquer East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia in rapid succession. When they finally capture King Aella, they subject him to the Blood Eagle, one of the most horrifying execution methods ever devised. They cut the ribs from the spine, pull the lungs out through the back, and spread them like wings. Some historians debate whether this actually happened or if it's exaggerated saga material. But the Vikings definitely wanted people to believe they did it. Here's what's wild: the Blood Eagle serves the same purpose as the Lindisfarne massacre. It's theater, psychological warfare designed to make enemies surrender without fighting. And it works. By 870, the Vikings control most of England. Only Wessex, under a young king named Alfred, holds out. The Norse warriors understood something that modern militaries spend billions studying: perception shapes reality in warfare. Make yourself seem unstoppable, and enemies defeat themselves. The Vikings had transformed from coastal raiders into conquerors, and they were just getting started. But the most audacious Viking raid hadn't happened yet. The year is 860, and a fleet of 200 Viking longships appears in the Bosphorus Strait. Constantinople, the richest city in the known world, capital of the Byzantine Empire, the jewel of Christendom, wakes up to find Norse warriors at its doorstep. Nobody saw this coming. The Byzantines had been so focused on threats from the east and south that the idea of Scandinavian raiders sailing across the Black Sea seemed absurd. But here's Rurik and his Rus Vikings, proving that no city is beyond their reach. They attacked the suburbs, burning churches and slaughtering civilians with their signature brutality. The Byzantine Emperor Michael III is away fighting the Abbasid Caliphate, when messengers bring news that his capital is under siege. He races back, but his army is exhausted and undermanned. The Vikings have Constantinople surrounded, and everyone inside knows what happened to Paris. Panic spreads through the city. This is supposed to be the unconquerable fortress, protected by massive walls and Greek fire. The napalm of the medieval world. But the Vikings aren't attacking the walls. They're terrorizing the countryside, cutting off food supplies, and waiting for the city to starve. Then something unexpected happens. Patriarch Photius, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, leads a massive prayer procession through the city. He carries a relic, supposedly the veil of the Virgin Mary, and dips it into the sea. According to Byzantine sources, a massive storm immediately rises, destroying many Viking ships. The remaining Norse warriors, spooked by what they interpret as divine intervention, accept a payment and sail away. Here's what actually happened: the Byzantines paid them off, just like the Franks did. The storm story was added later to save face. But the raid on Constantinople accomplished something more valuable than plunder. It announced to the entire medieval world that Vikings could strike anywhere. If Constantinople wasn't safe, nowhere was. This psychological impact cannot be overstated. Trade routes shifted. Coastal settlements were abandoned. Monasteries moved inland. The mere threat of Viking raids reshaped European geography. Meanwhile, back in England, Alfred of Wessex is having the worst year of his life. It's January 878, and he's hiding in the marshes of Somerset after the Vikings launched a surprise winter attack. Most of his army has scattered. His kingdom appears finished. This is the moment that defines Alfred's legacy. Instead of accepting defeat or fleeing to Francia, he uses the marshes as a base to launch guerrilla warfare. He's fighting the Vikings with Viking tactics, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, refusing to fight pitched battles he can't win. By spring, he's gathered enough loyal troops to risk a major battle. At Edington, Alfred's army faces the Great Heathen Army under Guthrum. The battle is brutal and close, but Alfred's forces win. More importantly, Alfred does something brilliant. Instead of trying to drive the Vikings out of England entirely, which is impossible, he negotiates. The Treaty of Wedmore establishes the Danelaw, essentially partitioning England. The Vikings get the northeast, Alfred keeps the south and west. Guthrum converts to Christianity, with Alfred as his godfather. This isn't total victory, but it's survival. And survival is what matters. Alfred uses the peace to build something revolutionary. A network of fortified towns called Buzz, positioned so that no place in Wessex is more than 20 miles from protection. He creates a navy to fight Vikings at sea. He establishes a rotation system for his army so he always has troops available. He's learning from Viking tactics and adapting them for defense. The Vikings, meanwhile, are evolving too. The settlers in the Danelaw start farming. They intermarry with locals. Their children speak both Norse and English. Within a generation, it becomes hard to tell who's Viking and who's Anglo-Saxon. This is how conquest actually works, not through maintaining pure bloodlines, but through cultural blending. In Francia, the same process is happening. Vikings who settled in what becomes Normandy adopt French language and customs. By 911, their leader Rollo formally becomes a French duke. His descendants will conquer England in 1066. Which means the Norman conquest is actually just Vikings conquering England again. Except this time they're wearing French clothes. The Viking impact on medieval Europe goes far beyond raids and battles. They established trade networks connecting Scandinavia to the Middle East. Arabic silver flowed north, Scandinavian furs and slaves flowed south. They founded cities, Dublin, York, Kiev. They discovered Iceland and Greenland. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus. But here's the thing that gets lost in all the dramatic raid stories. Most Vikings weren't raiders. They were farmers, traders, craftsmen. The raiders were a minority, but they're who everyone remembers because they're who everyone feared. The medieval chroniclers who wrote about Vikings were monks. The primary targets of Viking raids. Of course, their accounts focus on violence and terror. But archaeological evidence tells a different story. Viking settlements show sophisticated metalwork, complex trade goods, and evidence of peaceful coexistence with neighboring cultures. They weren't mindless barbarians. They were opportunistic warriors who exploited the weakness of fragmented European kingdoms. When those kingdoms got stronger and more organized, Viking raids declined. Alfred's defensive system worked. Fortified towns and standing armies made raiding less profitable and more dangerous. The age of easy plunder was ending. But the Viking legacy was just beginning. Their descendants would rule England, establish kingdoms in Sicily and southern Italy, dominate the North Atlantic, and fundamentally reshape European culture. The word /berserk/ comes from their warriors. /Thursday/ honors Thor. /husband/ is Norse. Half of English place names in northern England are Scandinavian in origin. The Vikings didn't just raid medieval Europe. They transformed it. And the most surprising part? They did it in less than 3 centuries. The transformation happened so fast it's almost hard to track. In the 790s, Vikings are terrifying raiders nobody understands. By the 1000s, their descendants are Christian kings ruling half of Europe. That's just 200 years. For context, 200 years ago from now, the United States didn't exist yet. So what actually ended the Viking Age? There's no single answer, which frustrates people looking for a clean narrative. But several factors converged around the same time. First, Scandinavia itself converted to Christianity. This wasn't a sudden spiritual awakening, it was political calculation. Kings realized Christian kingdoms got access to trade networks, diplomatic recognition, and legitimacy that pagan rulers didn't. Denmark's Harald Bluetooth converted around 960. Norway's Olaf Tryggvason forced conversion at sword point in the 990s. Sweden held out longest, but even they were officially Christian by 1100. Christianity changed the game completely. Christian Scandinavian kings didn't want their subjects raiding other Christian kingdoms. It was bad for diplomacy, bad for trade, bad for their attempts to be seen as legitimate European rulers rather than barbaric outsiders. The religious justification for raiding, stealing from wealthy Christians, was fine when you worshipped Odin. Evaporated when you worshipped the same god as your targets. Second, those targets got their act together. Remember how fragmented and weak European kingdoms were in 800? By 1000, they're organized, fortified, and dangerous. England under Ethelred the Unready still got conquered by Vikings. But even that conquest required a massive, coordinated invasion led by a king, Sweyn Fortbeard of Denmark, not random raiding parties. The days of 3 ships showing up and burning down a monastery were over. Now you needed an actual army. Third, and this is crucial, there were better opportunities elsewhere. Why raid when you can trade? Scandinavian merchants were making fortunes through legitimate commerce. The Varangian Guard, elite Viking warriors serving Byzantine emperors, offered steady employment with excellent pay. Iceland and Greenland offered land without having to fight for it. The risk-reward calculation shifted. Raiding became less profitable and more dangerous while alternatives became more attractive. But here's where it gets interesting. The Viking Age ends, but Vikings don't disappear. They just stop being Vikings in the way we think of them. The Normans, Vikings who settled in France, conquer England in 1066. They're Vikings, but nobody calls them that because they speak French and follow Christian customs. The Varangian Guard continues for centuries. Vikings founded the first Russian states. They're everywhere in European genetics and culture, just invisible because they've assimilated. This is what successful conquest actually looks like. Not maintaining some pure cultural identity, but blending so thoroughly you become indistinguishable from the people you conquered. The Vikings who settled in England became English. The Vikings who settled in France became French. Within 3 generations, their descendants couldn't even speak Norse. The mythology, though, that persisted in weird ways. Medieval writers romanticized Viking warriors as noble pagans, conveniently forgetting the slavery and violence. Modern pop culture does the same thing. Adding horned helmets that never existed and berserkers who probably weren't as common as sources suggest. We've created a Viking image that's partly historical and partly complete fantasy. Real Vikings were pragmatic opportunists. They raided when it was profitable, traded when it wasn't, settled when they could, and adapted constantly to changing circumstances. They weren't noble warriors following some ancient code. They were people trying to survive and get rich in a brutal world, using whatever methods worked. The most successful Vikings were the ones who stopped being Vikings. Rollo, who became the first Duke of Normandy, gave up raiding and became a French feudal lord. His great-great-great-grandson conquered England. That's a better outcome than any amount of raiding could have achieved. The Vikings who kept raiding eventually ran out of easy targets and faded into obscurity. The ones who adapted and integrated founded dynasties. What's the actual lesson here? Maybe that cultural identity is more fluid than we think. The Vikings weren't a unified people with a shared ideology, they were Scandinavians who went sailing for various reasons. Some wanted wealth, some wanted land, some wanted glory, some just wanted to escape their families. They became /Vikings because that's what their victims called them. They stopped being Vikings when they stopped raiding and started farming, trading, and ruling. The medieval period loves to categorize people into neat boxes. Vikings, Saxons, Franks, Normans. But actual humans don't work that way. They marry across cultures, adopt useful customs, switch religions when it's advantageous, and generally do whatever helps them survive and thrive. The Viking Age ended when being a Viking stopped being useful. Here's the final twist. We know more about Viking raids than Viking daily life because violence makes it into historical records. Peaceful farming doesn't. A monastery getting burned generates chronicles, letters, prayers. A Viking farmer successfully growing barley generates nothing. So our entire image of Vikings is skewed toward their most dramatic moments. It's like if future historians only knew about modern people through action movies. The Vikings transformed medieval Europe not through superior military might but through sheer persistence and adaptability. They found weaknesses in European defenses and exploited them. When those weaknesses closed, they found other opportunities. When raiding stopped working, they traded. When they couldn't conquer, they settled. When they couldn't stay pagan, they converted. They won by being flexible. And that's really what ended the Viking Age. Not a final battle or dramatic collapse, but gradual irrelevance. By 1100, there's no point being a Viking anymore. The opportunities that created them had vanished. Their descendants were too busy being Norman knights, English landowners, and Byzantine guards to remember their great-grandfathers once terrorized Europe from dragon-headed ships. The age ended not with a bang but with a wedding, a baptism, and a land deed. The Viking Age teaches us something uncomfortable about history. Violence works, at least in the short term. Those early raids on defenseless monasteries generated wealth that funded settlements, trade networks, and eventually kingdoms. The brutality wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It created the reputation that made future conquests easier. But here's what separates footnotes from empires: knowing when to evolve. The Vikings who kept raiding into the 11th century accomplished nothing memorable. The ones who recognized when the game changed, who traded axes for plowshares, literally. Those are the ones whose descendants ruled Europe for centuries. We remember Vikings as raiders because that's their most dramatic chapter. But their real achievement was disappearing so completely into European culture that we barely notice them anymore. Every time you say /Thursday or /husband you're speaking their language. When you visit York or Dublin, you're walking their streets. They're invisible because they won so thoroughly. The dragon ships are gone. The raids ended 1,000 years ago. But the Vikings, they never really left. They just stopped calling themselves Vikings and started calling themselves English, French, and Russian instead. That's not the end of their story. That's victory, comma.